Hello and welcome to today's video tutorial. We're going to be talking about effectiveness monitoring for the Monarch CCAA, and we'll touch a little bit on adaptive management and what that means going forward. My name is Iris Caldwell and I'm joined with Dan Salas from Cardno, and we're going to be walking through again the CCAA effectiveness monitoring requirements today. So first off, why monitor? So an important part of the CCAA implementation and overall compliance, as well as being able to track our overall net benefit that the CCAA is providing to monarch butterflies, is to have a way to periodically verify the effectiveness of those conservation measures that we're implementing on adopted acres, and then also have a way to inform adaptive management that may be required, or determine if there's other adjustments that we might need to be making in our implementation of those management practices and conservation measures to help improve the quality of that habitat for monarch butterflies. The data that we collect as part of this monitoring also is really valuable in generally helping us understand the conservation value that energy and transportation lands are providing to species like the monarch butterfly. It also will help inform potential changes in monitoring practices or thresholds that we may establish over the lifetime of the CCAA agreement, and generally also provides for flexibility and adaptability for the partners that are implementing conservation measures and understanding again where there is suitable habitat across their system and how those conditions and variability may change from place to place. Generally, there are two primary metrics that we're using to determine the effectiveness of the conservation measures that are being implemented as part of the CCAA. The first is the presence of milkweed, and we have basically two thresholds for determining sufficient milkweed presence. The first is a threshold for the Midwest and Northeast, those states shown on this map in the dark green color. And the threshold we have is 6 stems or more of milkweed per sampling plot. So if you are sampling an area and you have 6 or more milkweed stems, that's considered a sufficient habitat quality for that plot. If you have less than 6 milkweed stems, again, that is a potential trigger that there's opportunities for improvements or potential adaptive management in the future. For the West and South states, those that are shown in light green, the threshold is 2 or more stems of milkweed per plot. So a slightly lower threshold for the South and the West. The second monitoring metric that we're using is the presence of nectar plants. And again, those variety of plants that will provide key nectar resources for monarchs, particularly the adult monarchs. And we measure the presence of nectar plants as a cover threshold. So we're looking for 10% or more of nectaring plants across the sample area. This is an optional metric for the Midwest and Northeast, and it is a recorded metric, a required recorded metric for the West and South, although in the West and South you have the option to either achieve the milkweed threshold or the nectar plant threshold. Diving into that a little bit more detail, here we've mapped out essentially those requirements for milkweed presence and nectar plant resources, again, across those two regions, the Midwest and Northeast, shown here in blue. Again, the required threshold is the presence of milkweed at 6 stems or more. Optionally, you can also measure those nectar plant cover resources at greater than 10%. In red, we have the West and South metrics. So again, the option is to either achieve the nectar plant cover threshold at 10% or more, and or the milkweed presence threshold at 2 stems or more. In both cases, so across the Midwest, Northeast, West, and South, there's a number of optional metrics that we also encourage partners to monitor. Those would include collecting specific detail on the actual number of milkweed stems that you have on your plot. So not just yes or no, we've achieved this threshold, but actually collecting the number of stems or a range of number of stems on those plots. And similarly, collecting more detailed data on the estimated coverage of nectar plants on those plots. So again, not just yes, we've achieved the 10% threshold, but an estimate of what that actual cover or a range estimate of what that cover is for nectar plants. Lastly, on this slide, we also show what the adaptive management triggers are. These are shown in green. For the required metrics, again, the presence, absence, thresholds, if you're just simply using those or collecting that monitoring data, then the adaptive management trigger is if 10% or more of those monitoring plots lack either adequate milkweed or nectar plant cover, then adaptive management would be triggered. If you're collecting the additional optional data, then you have a little bit more flexibility. So essentially, you can look at your collected data more holistically, perform a 90% confidence interval, and if your confidence interval is below those thresholds, then that would trigger adaptive management. So again, we've provided a little bit more flexibility as far as the adaptive management trigger if you're collecting that more detailed data. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Dan to talk through some of the very specific requirements and how we envision implementing them in the field.
All right, thank you, Iris. Okay, so we're going to talk a little about the protocol itself, so how you actually implement the monitoring on your adopted acres. And before we dive into the field aspects of that, it's good to think about, what you need to do even before you get to that point. And so a few things to get you and whoever's helping you with monitoring be prepared for knowing what to expect and how to implement it is important. First off, reading through section 14.2 of the CCAA, which describes all those details of the effectiveness monitoring, is a good place to start. That's where this all begins and where a lot of the information that we're sharing here is referencing from. So review that, understand that. That's a good first step. Next, you want to make sure that whatever staff you have conducting the monitoring has the required experience and training. Now for the CCAA, we've intentionally kept the monitoring required to be very minimal and adaptable so that it really doesn't take that much experience or training, sort of a minimum amount, to go out and complete the protocol effectively. So what do people need to have to do the monitoring that's required? First is a basic understanding of the protocol. So perhaps reviewing this video, reviewing that section of the CCAA, being trained on what the requirements are in some fashion. Next is the ability to identify milkweed. So being able to tell, what a milkweed plant is compared to other plants that are growing in an area. And of course, with, a couple dozen different species of milkweed that occur, some are more, frequent than others. They do change regionally across the country. So being familiar with the types of milkweed that grow in your area and educating people who are conducting the monitoring on what those look like so they can know what to see and how to identify that when they're in the field. And in a similar fashion is being able to identify the difference between what we call potentially flowering nectar plants and other forms of vegetation that would not provide nectar. So broadly speaking, many broadleaf plants, provide flowers, and a number of those flowering plants provide nectar sources for monarchs. And so, broadleaf plants can broadly be sort of an analogous term for those potentially flowering nectar plants. Other forms of vegetation, such as grasses, sedges, or ferns, things that don't produce flowers or nectar would be excluded. So being able to tell the difference between those two broad types of vegetation is what we're looking for there. So you don't have to be a botanist, you don't have to know individual species, it's just a broad estimate of that cover within your plot. All right, and then last but not least, each organization conduct work, under what circumstances you can conduct work, and what's the appropriate personal protective equipment that's required for you while you're out conducting outdoor work just like this. So once you have all that together, then you want to think about the timing of monitoring. And again, in the CCAA, we're broadly open-ended in terms of when you can conduct the monitoring. We want it done sometime during the growing season. That growing season can vary, obviously, depending on where you are in the country. But we want to really focus monitoring on the time when it's going to be most effective, when you're most likely to identify milkweeds and those potentially blooming nectar plants. And for that, we suggest conducting monitoring ideally at the time around when peak bloom occurs within your part of the country. And so if you're not sure when that might be, talk to some horticulturalists or botanists in your area and some ecologists, and they can inform sort of generally when that would be throughout the year where you're at. Going out at the peak bloom period will help you to identify milkweed, oftentimes when it's already in flower, and as well as having with peak bloom hopefully the most number of nectar plants that are available when you're conducting that monitoring. So big picture, that's what you want to think about. But then there's some other nuances you want to think about there too. So monitoring has to be conducted on adopted acres. So that means those are areas where conservation measures are being implemented. Now, the monitoring in the CCA isn't intended to be a before and after or pre and post comparison of how the site is changing. If you want to know that information, there's a lot of other great protocols out there that can inform that. But for our purposes, we're trying to confirm whether or not we actually have habitat in these areas where we're doing conservation measures. And so you do want to think about the timing of your monitoring relative to when those measures are implemented. If, let's say, you were to go out and monitor shortly after, let's say, an herbicide application or maybe perhaps a mowing treatment, you run the risk of not achieving your monitoring variables just in that short interim period where that site is recovering from some of that vegetation work. So you want to take your monitoring timing into account relative to the conservation measures happening and conduct those either before those measures are occurring or with enough time afterwards so that you can capture, again, the suite of plants that are present on site when they're most identifiable. One other note too in terms of monitoring, when you're enrolled in your first year, we do require that monitoring is conducted in that first year and reported on that first year. So we understand that your organization is fulfilling the agreement, all the aspects of compliance under the agreement. But then after that, you do have the option that you could submit monitoring on an every other year basis or up to every 3 years. You do have to specify what your monitoring cycle is within your certificate of inclusion in your initial application. So that is something that you do want to think about upfront before enrolling and, again, having that specified in your application. Now, why would you want to do that? Some partners do have, let's say, intern programs or other partnerships that have monitoring occurring on those other cycles, cycles beyond every year. And so we wanted to allow the ability to accommodate those types of cycles in funding or resources to help fold that into the monitoring here. So you can take advantage of that if that's applicable for your organization and the situation you have in terms of having those resources and abilities to conduct monitoring. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the protocol itself in terms of what you're going to be looking at and how to sample in the field. So before you go out, before you plan on what you're doing, you want to think about what are you actually sampling for? What are you going to look at, and how are you going to capture that information? So again, going back to that section 14.2 in the CCAA and actually the table 14-2, where we outline the fields that are required for effectiveness monitoring. And so this has some of the consistent fields, and we'll talk a little bit about the opportunities you have for entering this information. There's several different options that are out there. You also may have your own tools and resources available. So whichever method of entering this data and recording this data you have, we want these fields to be consistently provided. You also want to think about the difference between the required versus optional fields that Iris mentioned earlier. And so as she showed in that one slide earlier that had the nice sort of breakdown of the required versus optional, the CCAA itself also has a description of what those fields are here. And I do want to encourage you, to the extent you can, if you have time and resources available, do try to collect that optional data. There's a lot of really, really great information we can gather from that can help inform not just your own organization's results and tell us a little bit more information about where you're finding habitat resources and to what extent, what do they look like. But that information also can more broadly help inform monarch conservation overall within the CCAA and potentially beyond. And it can also help inform the program development. So as we learn and grow from the CCAA through adaptive management, what does that look like? What do we know we have out there, and how do we document what that benefit is that the CCAA is providing and your organization's contributions to that? So again, I want to encourage you to collect the optional data if you can. Again, if you can't, then you can then focus on the required elements and provide that. Okay, so as I mentioned, we do have several areas where you can record the information. There is, first and foremost, in its most simplistic form, we have a monitoring template, which is available online on the Monarch CCAA Toolkit on UIC's website. And that's a simple Excel sheet, like you can see in the fields here below, that show the basic requirements in those fields that we talked about. And so you can enter that. There's an example there of that. Next, the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group also has their pollinator habitat scorecard, which is also available within the Monarch CCAA Toolkit. That scorecard was developed as a sort of a companion to the CCAA, but also can be applicable outside of the CCAA to have a consistent way that organizations across transportation and energy rights of ways can work together and trade information and share information on their habitat that they have that they're managing in a consistent manner. So there's several tiers, which again, the basic tier of that scorecard aligns with the required CCAA monitoring, but then there's a second and a third tier of that scorecard which provide more information. So if you are interested in those, before and after, pre-post sort of habitat assessments, or want to know more about the species that are at a site, you can get into that more detailed monitoring through a tool like the scorecard. That is also close aligned with the, there's a Survey 123 app that the Field Museum has helped develop that aligns with the scorecard and informs the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group's geospatial database, and so you can use that as well. Okay, beyond that, you have the Monarch Joint Ventures Rapid Assessment Tool for roadsides. So that also has a lot of these similar fields, and you can use that as a consistent tool. And then I know a number of organizations also have their own templates or their own tracking that they're using. And so again, as long as it's consistent with those fields that we shared in table 14-2, you can use your own method of recording and tracking that monitoring data that you're collecting. In the end, that all has to be provided to UIC as part of the annual reporting. So again, you want to have that in that consistent format and have the ability to share that. Okay, so now we know what we're looking for and how we can record it. Let's think about now in the field, what do we have to do and where do we have to do it? So first, how many samples do I need to take? We do have a table within the CCAA that describes the number of plots that are required based on the adopted acres target that your organization has. So as shown in the table here, let's say I have 5,000 adopted acres as my target. That would require me then to collect 30 sample plots. Now that is based on the minimum target. So if your organization does exceed your minimum adopted acres, you still are only required to collect that annual number of plots based on the minimum target. Now, let's say you have the ability to collect more sample plots. You are more than welcome to collect more samples. That'll give you more information, and it's those adaptive management triggers that Iris mentioned earlier. The more sample plots you have also helps give you more plots needed to trigger that threshold. So there could be some practical benefits to going out and sampling additional sites if you have that ability. Again, this is just outlining the minimum standard that's required. So, okay, after that, if you want to think about where to sample, the CCAA outlines that sampling should be conducted on adopted acres in at least one location for each of the conservation measures implemented. So if you're implementing, let's say, targeted herbicide and conservation mowing and set-asides, we want at least one plot within each of those areas where those conservation measures have been implemented. And then last, we also want those plots located broadly across the geographic distribution of where your adopted acres occur. So we don't want all the plots to occur, let's say, in one region or in one corner if you're providing adopted acres throughout, let's say, a broader geography or, let's say, like a state. So we want that to reflect the distribution so we can, again, as best we can, accurately characterize those adopted acres. So how do you randomly select sample sites? The protocol asks that you randomly select the sites. And again, the intent here is that we're trying to remove bias for the field sampling. We want to remove the chance of somebody driving up to a site, getting out and going straight to the location that has the most milkweed. And so what that means is selecting a site without that knowledge before you go out to a site. So as we have in the photo here, we have one plot located in one particular location. And so how would this be randomly selected? It could be through simply pulling up desktop maps, and let's say if we know a crew will be out in this area working for other purposes, or maybe they're going out intentionally just to monitor, we could just pick a point in sort of a mid-span location like this. And then when they get out there, they're going to be required to sample in that location. So, it's in an area that has some grassland, and so we think, okay, there might be some potential for habitat there. Let's say they did some targeted herbicide work. Just pick a point, and they're going to go out to that exact point and sample starting from that location. It could be as simple as that. If you want, you could use other techniques like using random number generators or random selection through GIS tools, where if you have that ability, if you have those the geospatial mapping, you can randomly select plots that way. That some people might find that easier, but again, that's not a requirement that you take it to that level for random selection. One other option to think about too, which I know some partners are looking at, is using previously established monitoring sites. So some have monitoring sites that they already use for other purposes, and so for them, it's most effective and easiest if they can essentially roll the CCAA monitoring protocol into those existing monitoring locations. And that's perfectly acceptable. And if you fall into that boat, you can do that.
Dan, one question I know we get often is, do we have to change the sampling locations each year? Can you address that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for bringing that up. So, yes, in short, sampling locations can move from year to year, or you can keep them stationary in a single location. So it's flexible. Oftentimes, adopted acres will change year to year as different conservation measures are implemented in different locations. So especially if, as a vegetation manager, you're conducting treatments in different parts of your system throughout the one year to the next. Again, the sampling has to be conducted on those adopted acres. So if your adopted acres are changing locations, then your monitoring will have to change locations with that. Now, if you have a standard permanent plot in a location that is an adopted acre from year to year, If it's continuous in that location, then yes, you can use that plot there. All right, thanks again for that question, Iris. Okay, so now we're at the point where we're ready to go out in the field and sample. So we've got plots identified, we've reviewed our protocol. So what happens then when you get out there? What do you do? How do you conduct the actual field sampling? And again, the CCAA has a protocol identified within that. But long story short, you want to go out in the field, see wherever that something that will take you to that exact location. Then you want to think about your plot area. So our total plot area is going to be 1,500 square feet total. And the way we suggest as sort of a baseline approach to doing that in the field is that you start from that randomly selected point, and then you walk a 150-foot transect within the direction of the corridor being sampled. So like we have in the photo here along this distribution right-of-way, you know, we're walking linearly down that corridor with that 10-foot wide swath, which is identified by the cones that you can see in the photo there. And we're walking through that transect, looking at that 10-foot width, making a broad rectangular study area. You can see the image below, or the diagram below, shows what this looks like, you know, in a conceptual diagram. That diagram is found in the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group Pollinator Scorecard Habitat Assessment Protocol User Guide. So you can refer to that since that protocol aligns with the CCAA field sampling protocol here. So as you're walking that transect area, you want to meander through that area and, you know, go through that with the intent of looking at nectar plant cover and the number of milkweeds that are in that area, and whether or not they achieve or exceed those thresholds that Iris described earlier. Okay, so once you've walked through and sampled that, you want to record your findings, again, in whatever preferred method you're using, whether it's the tracking sheet, the scorecard, maybe perhaps via the Survey 123 app, or through some other method. Then you want to conduct any quality control review that you might have internally to your organization. So if you have somebody who's maybe verifying your sampling was conducted according to the protocol, you want to take care of that. Shortly after finishing your plots, again, that will vary, and that's up to you to what extent you want to do that quality control. And then ultimately you want to maintain those records and have those ready for compilation in your annual reporting back to UIC at the end of the year. So it's really simple. I mean, to go out and do a field plot, you know, especially after you're trained and you're used to it, really can just take several minutes while you're out in the field. So we hope that this can often be conducted as part of other duties while you're out there, you know, for other purposes. If you have a random plot, you can just go to that location, sample this, and you know, move on to other work. So that's the basic aspects of the field protocol. Again, it's fairly straightforward. We are looking for consistency there, though, because this is something that we are broadly applying across the country wherever we have adopted acres. Now, that said, there are a few areas and ways that you can apply some variations to this protocol. One would be conducting a circular plot versus a transect. So as we just described here, this 150-foot long transect is sort of the typical approach that we expect most people to use. But if you're in a small area, like let's say you have a you know, areas around, let's say, a substation or a solar array that has habitat where maybe a transect isn't the most appropriate method, you can use a circular plot instead. It's just that circular plot has to be within the confines of being 1,500 square feet. So we do need that area specific to be maintained. The other alternative you have, or option you have, is if you are surveying a long area, like let's say you want to characterize a large swath of a variable habitat, or a very long area. It could be a long roadside, similar to what you see here. You could select intervals, regular intervals along that corridor, and then average together those results to provide sort of a single plot result for that area. So if you're in the field and it's really variable, and it's a mixture across those adopted acres, and you want to characterize it that way, that's an alternative you have there as well. So those important considerations, that's what we wanted to flag here on the slide, is it's critical that you maintain that same area for sampling, that we have 1,500 square foot, no matter what the plot dimension is. And again, if you're using multiple plots, that you consolidate those into an average single record versus having 10 plots within a small area. Okay, so again, once you've conducted that field sampling, then this is going to get rolled into your compliance tracking and reporting. And so the compliance tracking is more focused on the implementation of your conservation measures. And so to the extent that you have those documented and available, what's important for monitoring purposes is that you want to align the field of the activity area with the area that corresponds within your conservation measure tracking. So that allows us to understand sort of where that sample plot was located relative to the conservation measures you're reporting on. Again, if you're tracking some of this geospatially, then that's another way where you can visually see the record located within a certain adopted acre. But if you're not, in its most simplistic form, just recording that in your data field itself, so we can align those with where the conservation measures are occurring. Within your annual reporting, we want you to describe the cumulative result of not just the conservation measures that were applied, but also the monitoring results that you found. So if you've sampled your 30 sites, or let's say you've sampled 50, how many of those achieved either having milkweed or nectar plants present? What did you learn from that? What did you find? Maybe there's some interesting lessons you learned from just being out in the field. We're looking for that information to get shared. And again, UIC will take all the different partners' information and roll that up into the program-wide report that they're going to provide to Fish and Wildlife Service at the end of each year. But that report depends on the information that you're providing as a partner. So having good and consistent data will help, again, the overall program report and document its effectiveness in bringing monarch habitat on the ground. So, and again, as we mentioned earlier, you do have the option that you could report after the first year on some other interval of up to 3 years, should that be more amenable or more in alignment with other resources or funding cycles that you have within your organization. Okay, so with that then, so we've reported on our results, and the next question becomes, okay, well, what if I've gone out, what if I've done my sampling and those monitoring thresholds are not met? So at a plot level, what happens if I don't meet either the milkweed threshold or the nectar plant threshold? We don't have either at a particular location. And again, this is where those adaptive management triggers come in, that it's baseline minimum requirement. If you have more than 10% of your plots that don't demonstrate there's no habitat there based on those targets that Iris mentioned earlier, that puts you in that adaptive management trigger where we want you to evaluate why you think that was the case. Was that maybe just where the sampling was conducted, or was there maybe something occurring that year that may or may not be within your control that was affecting habitat? We want you to tell that story and help explain what was affecting habitat on the ground in those locations. It's important to remember, though, that when we trigger into this adaptive management cycle, that is a learning and growth cycle, both for you as a partner as well as the program overall and Fish and Wildlife Service. So that's how we continuously improve upon and learn from our implementation and improve it for the years ahead. It does not equate to non-compliance. So there's been some questions about that and some confusion. And so just to be clear, if you don't achieve the monitoring targets, those thresholds, then that triggers the adaptive management. Non-compliance is only triggered by your organization failing to meet its commitments to the agreement. So if you don't provide, let's say, the minimum number of adopted acres that you've committed to, if you don't complete the effectiveness monitoring to the level that's required, if you don't submit your annual report, if if you're not tracking what's happening from a conservation measures on the ground, those types of activities result in non-compliance. So rest assured, if you go out to site, you don't have habitat for one reason or another, we still would like to get that information. That's helpful data to collect through the monitoring protocols that we've just discussed here today. And again, don't worry, because it's not a non-compliance issue at that location. So again, in brief, the adaptive management cycle is there to help ensure the net benefit of the CCAA. If we see consistent or overarching issues that aren't being addressed, or that come up as sort of be habitat deficient, this is the way that we can identify that and figure out how to adapt to those scenarios. To identify, is it something that we can improve from improving the conservation measures employed, or perhaps the way that we're looking or evaluating the habitat. So where having the optional data can help provide better information to inform those kinds of conversations when and if they occur. Again, not achieving a milkweed or nectar plant target in monitoring does not result in non-compliance. It's only not fulfilling the actions intended to be implemented under the agreement. So if you don't meet the monitoring targets, your certificate of inclusion will not be revoked simply because your monitoring targets were not met. And then last, what would that adaptive management look like? Again, that remains to be seen based on what we learn from the monitoring results provided. We don't anticipate that direct planting of milkweed would be a requirement as a result of that. I know there's been a lot of questions about that, on whether or not there would be a mandate to plant milkweed if the monitoring target isn't met in that location. But again, we understand that a lot of the conservation measures will support milkweed, either that might already be present or that might naturally regenerate just as a result of those activities that are out there in the field. So just finding ways to maybe improve their implementation or finding nuances that will help improve the conservation delivery is ultimately the end goal of adaptive management. Iris, was there anything else you wanted to cover on adaptive management there?
Yeah, the only thing I would add, Dan, is that we have addressed some of these common questions about adaptive management in the frequently asked questions document that you can find on the CCAA toolkit. So check it out there. Certainly if you have any questions on adaptive management or any of the monitoring requirements, don't hesitate to reach out to UIC and we can help answer those questions. So I think with that, we'll now go to the field and join Dan as he does some sampling in the field and gives us a bit of a demo on what monitoring looks like out on the right-of-way.
Hi, I want to talk a little bit about monitoring for the Monarch CCAA and looking for habitat when you have your adopted acres. And so before you go out and do your monitoring, first thing you want to do is make sure you have the appropriate safety gear and safety things in mind. So whatever you work, you might have requirements for gloves, eye protection, or a hard hat, or at least high visibility, especially if you're along the roadside. And beyond that, think about other things. Heat, having plenty of water with you. Also, depending on where you're at in the country and time of year, looking out for poisonous plants. We have wild parsnip here, there's poison ivy, things like that you want to watch out for when you're out as well. So keep an eye out for those things, be prepared, and be ready for going out and doing your monitoring. All right, so out here we have a plot that was randomly selected along our right-of-way. So we're sitting along a local road as well as an electric distribution line. And so here we know there's periodic herbicide treatments, spot treatments, and also occasional conservation mowing going on. So we want to evaluate this to whether or not see it meets the habitat criteria of the CCAA. And so depending on where you're at in the country, those could be one of two things. It is the presence of numerous milkweeds, and then also the presence of 10% or more nectar plants. Now, if you're in the Midwest and the Northeast,
The numerous milkweeds is defined by having 6 or more milkweeds within your monitoring plot. And if you are in the south or the west, it's 2 or more milkweeds in that monitoring plot. And no matter where you are in the country, 10% or more nectar plants is the target there. If you're interested in knowing whether or not you're located in the west, northeast, south, or west, refer to the CCAA, and there's a map in there that'll show you the extent of that. So we randomly select a plot when you're in the office. When you come out here to that plot location, then we're going to sample a 1,500 square foot area. And so we recommend doing a transect 150 feet long by roughly 10 feet wide, and walking that transect, evaluating it for those 2 criteria. And in its simplest fashion, you just need to say yes or no. Do you meet one of those 2 criteria within that plot? We do encourage you to take some of the optional data that's required by the CCAA, and actually, if you have time, do some stem counts of milkweed, do a actual percent cover estimate of those nectar plants, or potentially blooming nectar plants that you have within your plot. That information is going to be really, really helpful, not only for you going forward, but for the program overall as the program develops. So with that, we've laid out our plot. We're going to walk 150 feet by our 10-foot wide swath, and we are going to assess whether or not we have, in this case, 6 or more milkweed stems present, and or 10% or more flowering nectar plants. Okay, so I've just finished walking my transect, so 150 feet by 10 feet wide. You can see we have some cones placed here just to demarcate about where 10 feet is at. So I have a visual for the transect. That's optional. You don't necessarily need to mark things out, but it's something that you can do just to help you visually, especially as you're doing this protocol for the first time. And so I walked through here with the intent of monitoring for nectar plants and milkweeds. And again, we're here in the upper Midwest, so we're within the Midwest section, so our targets are 10% or more nectar plants, as well as 6 or more milkweed stems. So within this plot here that I walked, I actually had quite a bit of nectar plant cover. And again, nectar plants we broadly define as potentially blooming nectar plants. We're here close to the peak bloom period of the season, and so we have quite a few things in flower. We have, obviously there's wild parsnip here, which we want to be careful, we don't want to touch that. We have common milkweed, we have wild bergamot just getting ready to flower, and numerous other species, sweet clovers, black-eyed Susans, other things. So you don't have to be a botanist, you don't have to know all those species. Generally, for the purposes of the CCAA, if you have broadleaf plants, we're estimating the percent cover of those as potentially blooming nectar plants. Not all those will provide nectar always, but you know, as a broad brush estimate for people to use and assess habitat, it's a baseline metric that we're using so that even if you're not a botanist, you can use minimal training to complete that survey. So through this section, I actually estimated probably around 40% nectar plant cover. There is quite a bit of sedges and grasses mixed in through here, so the nectar plants are scattered pretty much throughout, as you can see in this section. Also, milkweeds. I actually counted there's probably about 60 milkweeds in this section as I walk through. And one thing to look out for was there are milkweeds that kind of border the plot here, and so I don't want to count the milkweeds that are located here outside of my plot. I really just want to focus on the ones that are inside my plot here. And so I had to kind of watch for that as I went through and counted these. So looking back at our monitoring criteria, do I have 6 or more milkweed plots or milkweed stems within my plot? Yes, I had 60. Do I have 10% or more nectar plant cover within my plots? And I estimated about 40%. So yes. So for CCA's effectiveness monitoring purposes, this plot, I would check yes to both of those options. Again, I could record the additional observations, the optional observations, and this would confirm that I do have habitat for monarchs on my adopted acres. Also, if you do observe monarchs while you're conducting this, I didn't see any here, but we've seen them around. I would want to mark that and indicate that as well.